Well, one of the key questions is how do we exactly perceive pitch? And a lot of it, as you can see from this diagram, is that our and you know some people might say somebody is thick-headed, and our heads actually are an object that sound waves bang into, that bump into, and essentially the positioning of our head positions our auditory system to process information depending on what we're trying to hear. Now, some people may have better hearing in one side of the head versus the other, but what you can see in this diagram is that when a sound goes off, the sound waves are packed together in these waves depending on the pitch and so forth. And ultimately, in a lot of cases, most sound is not one pure sound. It's a mixture of sounds, particularly even in a bell, in the case of a bell. But it hits one ear first, and our head, because of the fact that it's a solid object, creates a cavity, if you will, of sound or lack of sound. And our brain does a very quick calculation about how quickly this wraps around to then enter into the second ear. And this is what we refer to as a sound shadow. And based on that, we can figure out where things are in space and process information. Now, there are a couple different theories that are part of our understanding of how we understand pitch. The first one excuse me. The first one is something that we refer to as the place theory. And essentially what the place theory says and indicates is that we hear different pitches because different sound waves trigger activity at different places along the cochlear's basilar membrane. So depending on the place, that's why we get this, depending on the place will depend place on the membrane itself. We determine by where it falls on there and what it triggers in activity there, that we then determine the pitch by recognizing the place on the membrane. Now, if you were to think about it as a drum, if you were to hit the outer rims of the drum, you have a very different you have a different sound than you do on the interior of the drum, and that really is the basis on which this place theory is operating. Is that depending on what's stimulated where on the membrane itself, we make a determination based on that exactly what pitch is, at what sound level it is. The second thing is frequency theory, and again, just like we were talking about even with sight, we had a couple different theories, and what we began to find out is that essentially we're still back to kind of a both-and approach. But what frequency theory states is that the rate of nerve impulses traveling up the auditory nerve matches the frequency of a tone, and it enables us then to sense its pitch. Frequency, like we've already talked about, is the how frequently the sound waves hit our nerve impulse, or not our nerve impulses, but are sent up the auditory nerve, essentially. So based on the apparatus in the brain, how frequently these things are sent, travel up the auditory nerve, matches a frequency. So the neural impulse travels at different rates, and based on that rate or frequency, we determine the actual pitch. And at varying rates, and that's what leads us to determine pitch. Oops, pitch. That was awful. P-I-T-C-H. There we go. So what's contained in this particular theory is something they refer to as the Volley Principle. And if you if you think of any game that has a ball moving back and forth, we refer to that as a volley. We have volleyball, we have tennis, and essentially it's the same kind of concept here, where it says that hearing sounds with frequencies above 1,000 waves per second are part of this Volley principle that not amplifies, but helps us to understand the frequent or the nature of the sound that we're listening to. So this principle specifically, I got to take the Volley principle. This principle specifically is geared toward sound that is at 1,000 waves per second. Everything below that is part of this frequency theory. Essentially what we end up with, like we did before, is that the place theory explains high-pitched sounds, place theory, high-pitched, sounds, and the frequency theory, and you can probably guess, the frequency theory explains more low-pitched sounds. Low-pitched sounds. So essentially when we're talking about, we've got high pitch, we've got low pitch, what happens about the middle range? And essentially what you have is an interaction between these two, so we're not only determining place on the membrane, but we're also measuring frequency. And both of those work together in middle range sounds in terms of helping us to understand the sound itself and what is the nature of it. We locate sounds, and this is the other issue that is in this, is that we locate sounds, which is a key thing, is where is sound coming from by how they strike the ears. And if you think about where sound comes from, to the right, to the left, from behind, etc., we do all of that calculation to figure out localizing sounds and the really quite minute differences in intensity and the timing received by each ear. And so those are key components, intensity and timing, in terms of helping us to figure out where exactly the sound is coming from. Now, we just simply turn our heads to be able to figure out where a sound is, but turning our heads is also focusing through attention our other apparatus to figure out exactly what's going on in the world around us.